Good afternoon, and welcome to the Commonwealth Club of California. How many people here are members of the club? Well, good. For those who aren't members, I invite you to join the club, and you can get information at the front desk about joining. And for those of you who are, I invite you to get more involved in the club, join its various sections, and make it your club. My name is Scott Longwell. I'm chair of the Business and Economics section and a volunteer here at the club. And I found since I've become a volunteer, it's felt much more like my club. Today, we're listening to Robert Kanigal, author of The One Best Way. He's also author of Apprentice to Genius and The Man Who Knew Infinity. He's a National Books Critic Circle Award nominee, a Los Angeles Times Book Prize finalist, a New York Times Book Review Notable Book of the Year Award, a Library Journal Best Sci-Tech Books of 1991, and a New York Public Library Book to Remember. He is a recipient of the Grady Stack Award for Science Writing and many other awards, and has written for periodicals such as the New York Times Magazine, Civilization, and The Sciences. A full-time writer, Kanigal also teaches writing at the University of Baltimore's Publications Design Program, and previously taught at Johns Hopkins University's School of Continuing Studies. Born in Brooklyn, New York, he received his Bachelor of Science degree from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and he lives in Baltimore with his wife and son. Let's give Robert a warm welcome.
Thanks, Scott. What you left out is that I once lived in San Francisco. I lived here from 1971 through 1974, and I loved it then, and I left for various reasons. But I'm back now. I think it was about 2 miles from here that while I was on the cable car in '71, I got an idea for doing a book, and that book came to nothing. So I'm happy to be back now with a book under my arm, so to speak. For the next 25 minutes or so, I'll be telling you about Frederick Winslow Taylor, a name not often remembered today, but you're going to hear about him. It gave me great pleasure to write The One Best Way. I labored under circumstances that, viewed from the perspective of any other time and place, must be considered as almost ideal. I didn't have to worry too much about money. I was left free to write my book in my own way, subject only to the limitations of my ability, free to balance my schedule as I saw fit, to make mistakes, to follow up leads of my own choosing, and turn away from topics that interested me less than others. If I sometimes botched the job and went off on a tangent, or over-focused on one or another area, or worked too hard, or worked too laxly, or failed to pursue what to someone else might have proved a fruitful idea, that was my doing too. I have, in a word, enjoyed autonomy. That's the $5 word for it anyway. The opportunity to exert a say-so in your job, to do it your way. Work is more than how hard you work, more than how much you earn. What counts also is your freedom to exercise your ability as you wish, in your own time, subject to your own judgment. Autonomy grants pleasure. Quite aside from the merit or lack of it of the final book, the process of writing The One Best Way was, thanks to the autonomy I enjoyed, liberating and pleasurable. It enhanced my life, helped me to feel my own strength, left me with something that now, as I look back at what I began 6 years ago, fills me with pride and pleasure. I raise these personal sentiments, normally having no fit business in a talk like this, because it is this very concept of workers' autonomy that runs to the heart of the changes in the workplace and in all of modern life that Frederick Winslow Taylor, the subject of my biography, brought about. Frederick Winslow Taylor was the first efficiency expert, the original time and motion man. To organize labor, he was a soulless slave driver, out to destroy the working man's health and rob him of his manhood. To the bosses, he was an eccentric and a radical, raising the wages of common laborers by a third, paying college boys to click stopwatches. To him and his friends, he was a misunderstood visionary, possessor of the one best way, which, under the banner of science, would confer prosperity on worker and boss alike, abolishing the ancient class hatreds. 30-second biography of Frederick Winslow Taylor, which is not an encouragement not to read the book. But just to bring you up to speed, he was born in 1856. He came out of the Philadelphia Quaker aristocracy. His parents were abolitionists, heartfelt from the perspective of our time. You would say they were progressives, but they were very well off. They weren't rich like Rockefeller, but they were well off. As a boy, Taylor traveled in Europe for about 3 years with his family. He went to all the capitals of Europe. He hiked through the Alps. He saw all the art galleries of Munich and Berlin. When he came back, he went to Phillips Exeter Academy, bound for Harvard and a career as a lawyer. But while he was there, and he did very well there, but while he was there, he got a series of headaches that his family diagnosed as serious eye problems. And through a series of correspondence over a period of time, he or they decided to leave Exeter and abandon this plan for a career as a lawyer. He took the Harvard examination and passed with honors, but nonetheless he didn't go. And what he did do is he started as an apprentice, as a pattern maker in a small machine shop in Philadelphia. A pattern maker is the person who makes the wooden forms that go into sand that make the hollows from which castings are made. He worked as an apprentice for 4 years, and then he left the Enterprise Hydraulic Works to go to a place called Midvale Steel, and that's where he launched his revolution. He started on the shop floor at Midvale Steel Company in Philadelphia. As foreman, he insisted that the machinists who worked under him could do more than they said they could. To prove it, he took a stopwatch to each operation. Click, and the watch hand impetuously starts. Click, and the hand stops, the moment imprisoned on the face of the watch, 13.5 seconds. With a stopwatch, you could as easily measure what a man did in 10 seconds as 10 hours. And more, you could determine how long any part of a job took to do. Sometime in 1883, Taylor wrote later, it occurred to him that it was simpler to time each of the elements of a job and establish an overall time for it by adding them all up than to search through records of past jobs and guess how they might apply to a future one. Analysis rather than guessing. Here was true time study. Here, work was no longer an unbroken lump. It consisted of pieces, each of which could be timed and studied by itself. In time study, Taylor found a hidden bonanza. In breaking work into its components, you were almost forced to study it. What got in the workman's way? How could the machine be modified? Which operations could be improved? Which eliminated? At first, work might seem no more than a featureless smear of movement. But after a while, it was as if you were seeing it in slow motion. Each element of it highlighted, dissected, splayed open for view. And out of this close, careful seeing came detailed work practices, instruction cards, setting out every step of the work, each minutely described and timed. Taylor had seen time study as balm to an embattled shop floor situation. Here was the idea. By recourse to an impartial arbiter, ever fair-minded science, he and the men who worked for him would be able to rise above mere opinion with its raised voices to serene and stable fact. No longer need they fight over how to set the machines for maximum productivity or how long to allot for a job. Once the time study men had finished and a clerk had added up his columns of numbers, the time needed to machine an axle or overhaul a boiler warranted no further discussion. The numbers spoke for themselves. Well, that, anyway, was the idea. Taylor died in 1915. 4 years earlier, virtually overnight, he had become famous. A group of powerful railroads petitioned a federal agency for a rate increase. Didn't need it, future Supreme Court Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who represented the shippers, told them. They could save far more than the millions they sought by embracing the efficiency methods of a Philadelphia genius named Frederick Winslow Taylor, who for 30 years had been quietly perfecting them. Over the course of months, a dramatic, high-stakes battle played out in the pages of the nation's newspapers and magazines. By the end, Taylor and scientific management were on every lip, and efficiency was a national ideal. Pretty soon, the time-study men, the white-collar planners, the experts who knew better than the men and women who did the work themselves were everywhere. Peter Drucker has called Taylor's perhaps the most powerful as well as the most lasting contribution America has made to Western thought since the Federalist Papers. When Taylor's immensely influential book, The Principles of Scientific Management, first appeared in 1911, it was lapped up for translation into Chinese, Dutch, French, German, Italian, Japanese, Russian, Swedish, and even Esperanto, and even Lettish, which is the language of the Latvians. In World War I, French Premier Georges Clemenceau directed that Taylor's principles be placed in the service of the war effort. Lenin embraced Taylorism. So did Mussolini. So did Germany during the years between World Wars I and II. During the first half of the 20th century, Taylor became the paradigmatic American figure, bearer of a potent strain in modern life, decried by some, lauded by others, but always inescapably American. The Taylor system is to Europe not only an American lesson, declared one Finnish professor after Taylor's death, it is the American lesson. A League of Nations document called Scientific Management, a characteristic feature of American civilization. Scholars debate Taylor's influence on Henry Ford's assembly line, though influence there plainly was. But of the two, it may well be Taylor who had the more profound, lasting, and wide-ranging impact. But the assembly line found use only in certain industrial settings, whereas Taylor's contribution was an approach, a state of mind applicable to every aspect of life. Taylor himself said as much. The same principles of scientific management, he wrote, can be applied with equal force to all social activities, to the management of our homes, the management of our farms, our churches, our philanthropic institutions, our universities, and our governmental departments. By one definition, Taylorism is the application of scientific methods to the problem of obtaining maximum efficiency in industrial work or the like. And in that slight, almost parenthetic extension lies a hint of Taylorism's whole. Because while Taylor got his start in the factories of the industrial Northeast in the 1870s, it's not just industry that bears his imprint today, but all of modern life. Taylor bequeathed to us a clockwork world of tasks timed to the hundredth of a minute, of standardized factories, machines, women, and men. He helped instill in us the fierce, unholy obsession with time, order, productivity, and efficiency that marks our age. The question is whether all this is such a good thing. Well, on the one hand, of course it's a good thing. As a person, Taylor was tyrannical, insensitive, and bullish, and his scientific management was not always very scientific. But on balance, factories were more efficient after he and his men got through with them. And efficient means something. It means more goods, more services, less effort, higher pay, all the things that you and I and everybody want. Look around us at the standard of living so many of us enjoy today. And for the moment, don't take it for granted. We owe much of that to generations of engineers and time-study people and experts and planners. As for the autonomy I started off by talking about, and that the Taylor system typically makes the worker give up for the sake of efficiency, well, maybe you don't want to give people too much autonomy because they'll screw up, because they're mooning at the stars or thinking too much or insisting in doing it in a less efficient way because, well, they've always done it that way, or because they just like doing it that way instead of the one best way. Maybe too many people like that and you go out of business. It's easy to make fun of McDonald's, or for that matter, Starbucks, with its espressos made from precisely 7 grams of coffee, brewed for exactly 20 seconds everywhere in the country. But the fact is, too much autonomy, and the workers do it their way instead of yours, and the espresso comes out too weak or too strong, or the French fries turn out too greasy or not salty enough, or the doctor overprescribes, or perish the thought, takes too much time with the patient. So maybe Taylor's deficiency is exactly what the world most needs and wants. Maybe. Or maybe not. In a 1911 article in System, Putting the One Best Way into Practice, Edward Mott Woolley described a shop before and after Taylorism. Formerly, as in most shops, the mechanics did a large part of the planning how work, I'm quoting from this fellow, did a large part of the planning how work was to be done. They studied their blueprints and decided what operations were necessary, which should come first, and how they should be accomplished. They hunted up the tools they needed, borrowing them with or without permission. They drove their planers or lathes at whatever feed and speed they thought right. Now this was written, it bears reminder, to point up the egregious waste of such practices. And yet, some might read it today as the nostalgic evocation of a worker's heaven that granted ached-for independence. Many in white-collar jobs in blue would die for it. In the scientifically managed shop, the author went on, such archaic practices vanished. Today, the workmen do no planning. Every detail of work on every job is thought out for them and put down in unmistakable black and white. Not merely general directions, but the specific instructions indicating operations necessary on each part and the factors bearing on these operations. On it continued, devoid of irony, without a hint that the transformation might not be entirely benign. Well, many working people in Taylor's day didn't see it as benign, not benign at all. As a skilled, this is a quote, as a skilled workman, I want no task nor task setter to harass me at my work, said one American Federation of Labor vice president, a granite cutter. That would reduce me to an automaton. I didn't know they had the word automaton back then, but they did. It went all the way back there. That would reduce me to an automaton. Working men didn't understand the new Taylorist scheme? Oh, yes, they did. The new workplace efficiency aimed at remaking workmen in a new mold, I'm quoting, trimmed, polished with bulging muscles, swift of hand and foot, improved eyesight, shop value 75% more, governed by thought from the speeding boards. And for what? We repeat, for what? Among crimes attributable to scientific management, the word for Taylor's scheme, wrote an American machinist correspondent, was the assumption of a monopoly of brains among experts who schedule every movement so that a man is simply one of the gears in the operation of the machine. A man made the puppet of a planning department will soon cease to think of much else beside quitting time and payday. Time study, said another critic, practically eliminates the operator's or mechanic's personality, transforming him from a skilled mechanic into that of factotum or machine, and the foreman in charge only one grade higher but in the same class. This, be it noted, more than a year before Henry Ford's first assembly line had assembled anything. Now, it might be tempting to think of Taylorism as bearing only on blue-collar work, far distant in time and circumstances from our own. But for one thing, Taylor's system long ago percolated into all sorts of white-collar and professional work. It did not stop at the factory gates. In the 1920s, William Leffingwell, a Midwestern woodworker's son trained as a stenographer, applied scientific management to the office, experimenting with typists and clerks the way Taylor had with machinists and shovelers. Taylor could not have had a more devoted disciple write Sharon Hartman Strome in a book called Beyond the Typewriter, a study of the origins of modern American office work. Leffingwell saw malingerers behind every file cabinet, just as Taylor did behind every lathe. Efficiency reached into the doctor's office and operating suite, too. Where could the rationality of business better be joined to the rationality of science, wrote one historian of medicine, than increasing the efficiency of the hospital, or for that matter, that of medical care generally. Medical journals after Taylor carried articles like The Efficiency of Outpatient Work and Efficiency Engineering in Pelvic Surgery 1 and 2 Suture Operations. This last told how to save time and motion through better suturing technique and operating room organization. Beyond any other craft, wrote Robert Dickinson, the surgeon's work demands the new scientific management. And if the body, why not the mind? German psychologist Hugo Munsterberg, another admirer of Taylor, helped launch the field of industrial psychology. His pioneer textbook on the field, Psychology and Industrial Efficiency, was littered with references to Taylor's classic little workplace homilies. By 1930, writes one historian, scientific management had become a central feature of the practical curriculum. From the 1910s to at least the 1940s, a large percentage of business students and a smaller but not inconsiderable number of engineering students were exposed to the tenets of scientific management, whether they realized it or not. Even academia became a candidate for scientific management when one disciple of Taylor's, Morris Cook, was asked by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching to undertake a study of efficiency in colleges and universities. In academia, his 1910 report led off, one is struck with the absence of any gauge of efficiency which even remotely resembles, for instance, profits in an industrial undertaking. It urged measurement of faculty production in terms of student hours, remember those, and other quantitative measures, that teachers be inspected in class, that faculty work shorter but more intense hours, that comparing the efficiency of colleges and universities demanded standardization among them. Predictably, Cook's report appalled academicians. Predictably, its effects are felt today. Look around you, and Taylorist sensibilities are everywhere, from HMOs to McDonald's. Doctors denied choices they once enjoyed, ruled by the book. Hamburgers made by the one best way and not the any old way of Joe the burger flipper. Now maybe, just maybe, you've heard someone you know, maybe even someone in a seemingly good, responsible, high-paying job, grouse about his or her work, maybe, sometime. Maybe even not about his pay either, or an office that's too drafty or too hot or too crowded, but maybe something else entirely, something not quite so reassuringly concrete. Complain perhaps about how you can't do what you want to do, that you feel hemmed in by rules, or by too many busybodies breathing down your neck, or bureaucratic regulations, or too much imposition of numbers and standards. Not enough say-so over the work you do. Too much sacrificed for the sake of efficiency or productivity or some other word that means the same thing. Anybody read Dilbert recently? Here, then, is the enigma of efficiency to which I referred in the subtitle of my book. That in the natural, normal, sensible effort to achieve efficiency and thereby do great good, much harm, quiet harm, has been done in stunted jobs and withered, unhappy work lives. We want a lot, we humans. We want rich, satisfying work that challenges us and that grants us autonomy, freedom, say-so over what we do. And we want electricity at the socket for a nickel a kilowatt hour, and a car in the driveway that works reliably, and goodies and gadgets and toys and services, all cheap. But too often, the two don't go together in the same life. How can we, and I ask the question both of individuals and of our society, manage to get both? Or at least balance these two very different kinds of needs better than we often do? I really don't know. I'm not sure anyone knows. An enigma, after all, is an insoluble puzzle. I know only that it was this man, Taylor, perhaps more than anyone else, who helped deal us the sort of Faustian bargain that leaves many of us with material prosperity, but with work constrained, robbed of meaning and delight, or made so nervous and demanding we can barely stand it anymore. Not all workers, some workers. I concluded the prologue to my book this way. In Taylor's vision, man and machine work together like clockwork. In that vision lies the great paradox of modern life. Each day we reap the material benefits of the cult of workplace efficiency that he championed. Yet we chafe, we scream, we howl, we protest at the psychic chains in which it grips us. When young people during the 1960s sniped at the system, it was in part the Taylor system itself, institutionalized in corporate America, that they opposed. It was Taylor, after all, who first said in 1911, explicitly and without apology, in the past, the man has been first. In the future, the system must be first. And it might be argued, it is. Thank you. How do you want to work this? Whoops.
We have some questions for you, so
Okay.
don't go too far away.
Okay.
How much of an influence do Taylor's theories still hold today? As corporations become increasingly less hierarchical, will scientific management become totally obsolete?
I think the mere fact that the management theories of today are all, in effect, to try to counter Taylor, testifies to its influence. I met one management consultant who said he spent, basically his whole life was devoted to undoing the damage that Taylor had done. In the years after Taylor was famous, in 1911, people talked about Taylor. People talked about Taylor as the influence, the person who had done this. And as the 1920s and the 1930s went by, people just sort of accepted it. It was sort of something in the air. And I think that's the case now. I think the mentality that separates doing and planning is still very much in the air. And I think most of the efforts to try to undo that are probably a good thing. And I think they're a healthy thing. But we shouldn't be too distracted by the management theory of the moment that may not be widely institutionalized in American society and American business.
On that, could you compare and contrast Taylorism with some of the more popular management fads or theories today, such as total quality management, the process maturity model, learning organizations, and leadership work teams? Especially those first two, total quality management versus process maturity model versus Taylorism.
No. No, I can't. My world, the world that I've been immersed in for these many years, is a world that stopped in 1915. I do know that all the people I've talked to speak of Taylorism as the one fixed object in their cosmos that they're trying to battle against. And the fixed point is that of a group of planners and thinkers and experts off on one side, and a group of other people who merely do what they're supposed to do. And to the extent that these new management theories reflect that same bias, that bias of the split between thinking on the one hand and execution on the other, there are really other sides of the Taylorist coin.
You touched on people wanting more autonomy, and autonomy making people happy. There's a quote from Devo, is that freedom... From whom? Devo, the rock group. Mm-hmm. Freedom of choice is what we have, freedom from choice is what we want. Would you say that there are certain people who are happy with autonomy while others are happy without it?
I think Taylor grew up in a world where there were lots of people. We're in a different world now. And in the 1880s and the 1890s, there were people coming off the boat who were happy to have a job, and they measured their success by how much income they could supply to their family. And when they got a raise that Taylor was able to give them, they were thankful for it. I think the world has changed, and I think American business hasn't necessarily changed with it, although as these current theories suggest that it's beginning to. I think not everybody does blossom with autonomy. Not everybody wants choice. But I think some people do like to be told what to do. It's comforting to them. I'm not one of them. and I'm not sure that many of the people here are among them. And I'm not sure that we should be so quick to assume that all those people out there don't want the choice that we take for granted. I think that was, in some ways, Taylor's tragedy, that he was not willing or able to give the workers who worked for him the same element of choice that he took for granted in his own life. Taylor was not a regimented person. BBC Scotland did a radio play based on, in part on my book, and the actor that they got to play Taylor could not get out of his mind that Taylor was supposed to be this tight-ass efficiency expert who just, very clipped and everything like that. And he acted out Taylor that way, and Taylor was not. Taylor was an ornery cuss who cursed up and down, who liked to do things on his own schedule, who was late for meetings, who kept the boss waiting, who got into trouble. And I can't imagine Taylor himself or anybody in that spirit willingly working under the Taylor system or anything like it. I think today, more of us, one of the pleasures of life for more and more of us is groping at or seeking some of the autonomy that only wealthy people had back then.
There's a question about Taylor's career, as in how long was it and how did it evolve? And also someone wanted to know, did he get rich off of this?
Taylor started off rich. There was some people tried to look at the fact that he served an apprenticeship as indicating that this man came up out of nowhere. But that wasn't the case. He started out very wealthy, and basically he remained wealthy. Basically his career was he worked at Midvale Steel until 1890. He went to work for a paper company until 1893. Between 1893 and 1901, he was a consultant. He was one of the earliest management consultants. Along the way, he was also an engineer. Along the way, he developed a new kind of tool steel called high-speed steel that did make him, in fact, a lot of money, even in addition to everything else that he had. So he was well off. And then in 1901, he retired, and he liked to say, I think he got a lot of mileage out of this, I can no longer afford to work for money, by which he meant that his ideals and what he wanted to do with scientific management was so important to him that this rose above mere considerations of money, and he would have a parade of industrialists coming to his estate at Boxley just to listen to these 2-hour monologues surrounded by the rose bushes and the beautiful views of the valley in his elaborate mansion. And then he, up until between 1901 and 1911, he was well known like you and I are well known. In other words, within our little fields, people knew all about him. And then in 1911, as I described briefly before, he became famous. He became this household name, and that was in 1911. Then he died, 1915.
Just got a little more than 50 minutes of fame then. Right. Didn't get to that. Another question is about you. What prompted you to write this book? Did you know much about Frederick Taylor before you began the research?
I first heard about Frederick Taylor when I was 15 years old. John Dos Passos, an early 20th century novel, wrote a book called the USA Trilogy, which is very unusual in that it used all sorts of innovative literary techniques, some that were almost a cross between poetry and prose. And one of them were these little capsule biographies of famous people of the time. Woodrow Wilson, Rudolph Valentino, the Wright brothers, Henry Ford, and one of them was of Frederick Winslow Taylor. And this 8-page semi-poetic account of his life somehow locked onto my teenage sensibilities and stuck with me, so that 30 years later or so, when I was looking around for the next book that I wanted to write, I came across some 2-by-nothing little routine clipping about Taylor revisited 75 years later or something, and that little clipping clicked in with the Dos Passos account from 35 years later, and I said, aha, this is the man I want to write about.
If Taylor were practicing his craft today, what would he think of all the technology we use, and how would that change how he would be applying his theories?
I think he wouldn't be applying his theories in the same way. Taylor was, from everything I can see, and it's hard for a biographer of a person to admit this, Taylor was not a supremely creative person. I think the case with Taylor is that he got one good idea, or one bad idea, depending on how you want to look at it, but one strong idea, and he milked it, and he believed in it. He believed in it as deeply as he believed in anything in the world. And he proselytized this one idea, and he was like an evangelist for this idea. And he did it for all the rest of his life, first within a small coterie of workers, and then among a larger and larger assortment of people until it spread around the world. And I think what Taylor would do today is if he would be latching on to some other idea. Most of the ideas of scientific management were in the air at the time Taylor lived. They were not new ideas. What was new is to take them and channel them and funnel them into a new thing, and that new thing was scientific management. Somebody gave the example of the Wright brothers in trying to explain Taylor's contribution, and I was kind of moved by this, that what did the Wright brothers do? I mean, the propellers were there, engines were there, structural knowledge was there. What the Wright brothers did was take existing technologies and put them into a new and different form. And that's really what Taylor did. Taylor took what was in the air and made it into something new, and then he pushed it for the rest of his life. And today, he'd probably be doing something very similar.
Question from the audience. Historically, every major increase in productivity has been associated with a greater percentage of the total time spent in planning, and a lesser percentage doing the work. Is this a confirmation of Taylor's basic principle?
Yeah, I suppose you could say that Taylor started it. I mean, it's easy to be distracted by stopwatches and clipboards and time study people going around. But to me, the absolute fundamental contribution or the step that Taylor took was to make this barrier, this wall between doing and planning. And you can argue that the growth of the white-collar workforce goes straight back to Frederick Winslow Taylor. Typical numbers, I don't remember the exact numbers, but something like this. A company that had 100 workers and 3 or 4 bosses, or white-collar people in general, might, when Taylor was finished with it, have 50 or 60 workers and 15 or 20 white-collar people. That's what Taylor did. He was saying, you people off on the side, in the planning department, in the office, you think about how this work is to be done, get it down right, figure out the one best way of doing it, and then tell the people who are left how to do it more efficiently.
Now, what would Frederick Taylor or yourself say in response to Tom Peters, who speaks often at the club? And for those who don't know, he co-wrote In Search of Excellence and many other management consulting books. He's famous for saying things like ready, fire, aim, that we have too many chiefs and we need more Indians, and that you should do more doing and less planning.
Yeah. Well, that's obviously directly counter to Taylorism. In fact, in that balance between planning for doing and doing, Taylor got into all sorts of trouble because he would say, well, to do this thing right, to install, that was the word they used, to install scientific management in a complicated factory requires 3, 4, 5 years. And the people who hired him, did they want to wait for 3 or 4 or 5 years? So they were hurrying him constantly and saying, enough of the planning, get some results, I want to see results. And very often the results didn't come that early. But when Taylor did have his say, when he did have the time to do it at his own relatively slow pace, the long-term benefits were pretty considerable. I think that this whole ethic, though, of, I think what he's reacting to is this whole ethic of, well, we got to have lots of people planning and figuring, and then these are institutionalized in white-collar positions, and pretty soon you have this huge bureaucracy that's slowing everything down, and you're not doing anything anymore. It's sort of the opposite extreme.
Now, we brought up before the issue of some people liking a lot of supervision and others not. We're doing a series right now at the club on the one-minute manager. Kenneth Blanchard talks about situational leadership and saying that you should actually lead and manage people differently, both different people differently, depending on their skills and motivation, and even the same person differently, depending on their skills and motivation for that particular project. So if they're low skill and low motivation on that particular project, you should tell them exactly what to do and not tell them why. And then there's several other steps until you get up to delegating, in which case you set the ground rules, you tell them where to go, and you fully delegate it and they decide how to get there.
This would have been completely beyond Taylor. Taylor had a sort of black and white world. Remember, he was the first person who had done this, and it's very common. I mean, you can't expect him to invent the world right there on the spot. To invent anything that we take for granted now, the internal combustion engine, the modern car, has a history. And Taylor could not have done everything at once. What he did was serviceable enough. But at the time, he had sort of a simplistic view of things by the standards of our time. He grew up in the Depression of I think this has been unappreciated. He grew up in a Depression. When he worked as an apprentice in the pump works in Philadelphia, there was like one of the most serious depressions of the last 100 years, from 1873 to 1878. And he saw people around him starving who were all they could think of was in terms of where the next paycheck was coming from. And their whole orientation, as it was in the 30s more recently, was on money, on making a living, surviving, getting by. And I think that contributed to Taylor's monochromatic view of things.
Did he ever get himself in trouble by applying it in places where it didn't work? And one example that we brought up before, the idea of the process maturity model, that answers some of Tom Peters' issues of when you should do a lot of planning, when you should do a little. That model would say that if you've got lots of experience in an area like Procter & Gamble, it makes sense to spend a year planning if you're going to bring out this soap. If it's some new area that you don't have experience in,
you should just rush into it,
or it's a whole new market or whole new technology, then asking people or planning doesn't do you any good. You're just analysis paralysis. You should just go do, test small, fail cheap, see what comes out.
Taylor was, if you applied that model, I think it would be interesting to do that, because when Taylor was in the machine tool industry, this was a pretty well-developed, mature industry, and people pretty much knew what they were doing. In 1890, he started up a paper mill with a new industrial process, and he tried to apply the same principles to that, and he got into trouble there. Of course, he got into trouble everywhere he went, not only with the workers, but with the bosses, as I said earlier, who wanted quicker results from what he was doing. He got fired, he got or relieved of his responsibilities, if you're a manager. He got into trouble wherever he went. But I think that principle sounds like it could apply very well to the different kinds of work that Taylor got involved in.
We have a question here about how capturing information about people, before the time in motion studies, it was impersonal. They wouldn't be information about individuals. Now with computers and technology, a person at someone's desk can see how long it's taking each individual to do work, and how does that affect the political environment?
The political environment?
Well, put it in office politics. Now it's an interpersonal thing, that people feel they're being watched. People feel there's a record of how fast they do things.
It took me a while to understand the union position in 1911. And Taylor, I think, never understood it. There's a scene in Schindler's List where the Nazi commandant comes around to the camp and asks one of the Jewish workers to make a certain number of things. And here's this commandant who has the power of life and death standing over you, looking at you. What is and this is an extreme version, I mean, the guy was petrified, but I think there is something general and universal about this that the unions correctly identified. There is something, as I stand before you, you are looking at me, I am being judged in a measure. I mean, let's face it. And there is something uncomfortable about that. There is something disquieting about that. And this happened also in every situation where you have a time study person coming in from the outside and standing over you with a stopwatch and a clipboard looking at you as you do your work. Taylor and his crew would say, there's no difference, you just do your work. I'm not trying to hurt anybody. But psychologically, there is an effect of having somebody stand over you and stare at what you do. And I think this has become more generalized in the whole computer world, where the computer is keeping track of what you do, monitoring keystrokes, for example, or noting how many seconds it takes for you to respond if you're an operator, say. All these things have been computerized, but the fact that it's numerical, the fact that there is still this, in this case, an electronic peering at you, I think inevitably is going to leave people feeling simply uncomfortable at work. People don't like it.
That actually leads into the next question about the Hawthorne effect, which I'll explain quickly for people who haven't. There's many nodding heads, but that's when Hawthorne did an experiment to see how the amount of light affected how fast people worked. And so they raised the light, and work went up. They raised the light levels more, people produced more, and they started lowering it, and work still went up. They lowered it again, and work went up more, until it got so dark people couldn't work at all, and then it actually started going down. People usually portray that as that it was going up, not because people felt threatened, but because someone cared, that they were being watched, and so someone cared what we were doing, and they felt good, and so they worked better.
I think the difference, though, is that was a group phenomenon more than, there was, the Hawthorne effect, without their realizing, I think, was invoking the sense of camaraderie that comes when you're in a group with people who are all going through the same kind of experience as they were. Actually, I think people have gone back and studied the Hawthorne effect and found that it wasn't quite as straightforward as it comes down to us in the management texts.
If you were applying Taylorism, how would you apply it to the Commonwealth Club or to our talks here?
It's been so welcoming and friendly, maybe I wouldn't want to touch it.
Well, on that, we'll end our talk for this evening. Let's give Rob a big round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.